All right, so now in lecture number 9, Steiner moves on to his analysis on the 9 Beatitudes, which Christ gives the moment that he delivers his very long Sermon on the Mount, where he gets up on to the Mount and then speaks a very long moralizing sermon that lasts for several pages until it looks like this is chapter 5, Matthew 5, and then it ends, he comes down from the mountain on Matthew 8. Notice the contrast between the two Gospels that we've studied so far, Matthew and Mark. Whereas Mark begins with the baptism, and then the moment that he's had the baptism, there is no temptation, so we don't have the 3 temptations. He just goes and grabs his 4 disciples, Simon, Peter, Andrew, James, and John, and then proceeds to perform exorcisms. He just gets right to the business of expelling demons from the physical world. Whereas here, to get to the equivalent point in the narrative is much longer. After he is baptized, then he goes out to experience the 3 temptations, and then he's gathered up his first 4 original disciples, and then he ascends to the Sermon on the Mount. Instead of performing exorcisms, he goes into a very long meditation on ethics, on specifically Christian ethics. So that the Matthew writer is much more concerned with morality than he is with a cosmic battle between, let's say, good and evil, or human forces versus demons. He's much more concerned with the human side of Christ and with humanizing Christ and with how people ought to behave. And he gives short shrift to the exorcisms. In the paragraph right before it, all it gives, which Mark takes a very long time to go through and shows you all these different exorcisms that Christ performs and healings and such. All Matthew says is that he went about Galilee teaching in synagogues, preaching the gospel and healing every disease and every infirmity. They brought him the sick, those afflicted with various diseases and pains, demoniacs, epileptics, and paralytics, and he healed them. Clearly, the Matthew Gospel, or the author of the Matthew Gospel, isn't interested in any of the spectacular, the stuff I prefer very much more, the spectacular cosmic battles, but emphasizes the much more Jewish nature of Christ by tracing his historical lineage in the first place, to show his descent from the Judaic folk soul, let's say, and with the moralizing that the Old Testament is constantly obsessed with moralizing. It gets a little ad nauseum. So too here. But now notice, too, that we saw what the first temptation was the temptation of turning stones into bread. And then Christ says, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes out of the mouth of God. And here the first thing he does, it says, seeing the crowds, he went up on the mountain. And when he sat down, his disciples came to him, and he opened his mouth and taught them, saying. So in other words, man does not live by bread alone. We tend to think that because our senses have been designed from the moment we wake up each day for the ego to look through them as filters so that we can go get food and keep the physical body going, or to find a mate to reproduce with. Either way, many people think that's the point of life. That's all there is, because it's so evident that that's why we have these senses, to eat and reproduce. Yeah, then what? Then what? Once your basic needs are met, then what? You're just a herd animal being swept along with all the other cattle, by all the various isms that you're being manipulated with through capitalism, advertising, and such to manipulate these base desires. And you're always spending your life reacting to various stimuli being beamed at your industry. Meanwhile, you've missed the whole point of life, which is to bring down knowledge. This is why we're human, and why Heidegger said that there is such an abyss of difference between the human being and everything else that lives, all animals. It's not the case, as science says, that just because we've inherited these bodies from apes, that we're therefore fancy apes with intellect added on. That's not correct. The whole reason for the expansion of the cranium in order to produce a brain so that we can think is to act, let's say, that the brain is like a magnifying glass when you're trying to magnify sunlight to burn a leaf, as we used to do as kids in Phoenix, or ants. Kids don't give a fuck. They'll torture anything. Oh, let's take the legs off this grasshopper and see if he can still hop. They're wonderfully cruel, the cruelness that comes out of them. But anyways, the whole point of being human And to have this brain is to bring spiritual energies down into the animal world. The animals don't give a fuck about the spirit. All they care about is struggling and ripping each other to pieces. That's all the dinosaurs ever did. They spent a couple of 100 million years ripping each other to pieces. What a pointless existence. Our existence is not pointless as human beings. We have karma that we've inherited from previous lives, and we've come down here to do specific tasks to fulfill karma so that we can, in the next lifetime, move on to other specific tasks and have different experiences, and so forth and so on. It's all very purposive, and it all has to do with bringing spiritual energies down onto the physical plane. And so when Christ opens his mouth now up on the mount, on a plane, i.e. of elevated consciousness, it isn't to put a piece of bread in it, but to spew forth the Logos, the Word of God, which he does by delivering the first of the 9 Beatitudes, which now Steiner maps onto his model of the subtle body, which we might, for those of you who haven't seen the earlier videos, outline of esoteric science and so forth. So we have what we've been talking about all along, the 4 basic bodies, the lowest of which is the physical body, which we share in common with the mineral world. Then above that, the etheric body, which animates it, which we share in common with plants. And then above that, the astral body, which plants do not have because they do not have a waking being, what Spengler calls a Wachsein. They are pure being there, Dasein, there-ness, not Heidegger's sense, which is different. And then we have astral bodies, which we share in common with everything with a nervous system, and probably things that don't have nervous systems, but nonetheless are consciously aware and moving around in space, unlike the plant that is bound to a specific locale. Then we have, in addition to what animals do not have, is reflexive self-awareness, i.e. an ego. We are conscious that we are conscious. We are conscious of being a self in a world amongst other selves and other entities and beings. We're aware of this. And the ego is like a mirror that tells us this. Animals don't have that. They simply are naive. Everything they do is instinctive. Everything they do is purely naive. They're not even aware that they are animals. That's the ego. But then Steiner breaks the ego further down. He says the ego sort of holds together these other 3 components of the soul, what is called the sentient soul, which has to do with the orientation to the outer world through the senses, but also in terms of pictographic thinking. It's sort of right brain thinking, which thinks in terms of images. And then above that, the intellectual soul, which would be left brain thinking, of course, which would be thinking in terms of concepts. And then the consciousness soul, which has to do with freedom of the will. The consciousness soul is precisely what the phrase, where there's a will, there's a way, means. When I will to pick up this pen, I have just used my consciousness soul. With my sentient soul, I just perceived that it was there. I noticed it. With my intellectual soul, I identified it as a pen. So I've very quickly and rapidly, with lightning fire speed, identified it conceptually as a pen. And now I've used my consciousness soul to pick it up and show it to you. 3 different components of the ego. The ego holds all 3 of these together. Then above that, so the lower 3 are body, the middle 3 are soul, and the upper 3 are spirit. They're purely spiritual faculties that are mostly latent within all of us now as a species, because they will require different historical epochs to unfold them. The lowest being the manas, or the spirit self, the next one being the buddhi, or the life spirit, and the top one being the atma, or the spirit body, or spirit man. Certain individuals who are precocious spiritually and more advanced among us, the Steiners and the Aurobindos and so forth, the Chardins, have developed these upper faculties. But humanity as a whole won't develop them, because until way in the future, because each of Steiner's epochs develop a different aspect of these subtle bodies. The epoch within which the Christ being has incarnated is the 4th of his post-Atlantean epochs, the Greco-Roman epoch, whose task was primarily to unfold the intellectual soul, or the mind soul, which corresponds to Jean Gebser's mental consciousness structure. Now what has happened, though, with the development of the mind soul, with the shift from thinking and accessing the spiritual world through clairvoyant vision, which means to use the astral body to peer into the spiritual world and see the happenings there. And myths, Steiner says in this chapter, myths are records of events going on in the spiritual world, clothed in the language of sense-perceptible images, the sentient soul, in other words. sense perceptible images. But some myths are also recountings of other processes going on, not just within the sensible world or within the spiritual plane, but recountings and encodings of the mysteries, of the initiatory processes of the mysteries, like the story of Lugobanda that I was recounting last time, clearly has retained knowledge of what the mysteries were like. So some of the myths, like Pan's temptations of Zeus, also, which are similar to Satan's temptations of Christ here, are also recordings of the initiations. But the Gospels don't just repeat mindlessly the mysteries and the initiations. They do so on a historical turn of the spiral with the age of the development of the intellectual soul, which has lost clairvoyant ability. So now it's shifted into conceptual thinking. And not only that, but the human being has entered more fully into his physical body, and the physical body with the ego in it has entered more fully into the physical plane, so that we've lost contact with clairvoyant abilities, lost contact with an easy ability to see into the astral plane, which is now only reserved for certain special people among us who have these kinds of abilities, mystics, mediums, these kinds of seers, these kinds of people who still have access to a certain amount of clairvoyant vision. So there's been a loss. And so now with the first of the Beatitudes, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. The reason Steiner says that they're poor in spirit, and this has to do with the physical body's immersion into the physical world, is because they've lost contact with the clairvoyant world. And they're sorrowful about it. They want contact with the spiritual world again, which the whole mystery of Golgotha, the Christ event, is designed to give back to them. So then the second of the Beatitudes, blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. And in other words, suffering. With respect to the etheric body now, Steiner says that this Beatitude refers to the idea that the etheric body now is the seat of all suffering. It repairs damage done to the physical body by the passions and desires of the astral body. But the whole point of it is that it's in ancient healing, what would happen would be a seer or a shaman or someone would be able to channel spiritual energies through clairvoyant vision from the spiritual world to stream down into the physical body to activate a person's etheric body to heal them. But now the Christ being has made available new energies that are poured into the etheric body as a comfort for suffering. The next beatitude is, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. In other words, the humble, the unprepossessing, those who do not who are not guilty of hubris and pride and so forth. They've got control, in other words, over their astral bodies because of what the Christ has given them through the exemplary life that he has led as a life of control over the passions. Not an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. If your enemy strikes you, offer him the other cheek. Compassion and love now becomes the response of those who are meek with regard to the astral body. They are unassuming because they've got control over their passions. So the next beatitude is, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Now Steiner says this has to do now with the sentient soul, that the sentient soul needs now to experience the intensity with which the body experiences, the physical body experiences hunger and thirst. Now for things that have to do with the soul, the sentient soul needs to be attuned to that level to have a thirst for things that have to do with the realm of soul and spirit, not just the body. And then so we have the next beatitude, blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Steiner says now this moves up into the intellectual soul, which is so far is the one part of the human being that is truly human, in the sense that everything from the sentient soul on down through the other bodies are all aspects of the human being that are infected with divine spiritual beings or in connection with them. The intellectual soul, you might say in Kundalini Yoga, is the awakening of the heart chakra. So mercy and compassion, which in our examination of the Sephirot last time is Chesed, the right hand, which is the hand of compassion and mercy. And this is the truly human virtue, that we can have compassion and mercy, that we can think, use the intellect to think about the harm that your actions could do to cause other people. And it requires thinking in order to tame your astral body. And then so we have, blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. This is the consciousness soul now, with its aspect of the will and receiving the Christ energies into the human heart. And Steiner also says that, and he's said this quite a bit elsewhere, that blood, the circulation of the blood is the carrier of the ego. So, and of course, the center of circulation of the blood is the heart, of course. So that's the thing that gets magnified here, as the circulation of the ego of Christ, as it were, through the blood. That changes your will, the consciousness, soul, and the things that you will. Then the upper three are a little more obscure, I have to say. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. And he says that these upper three relate to the upper faculties of spirit, self, life, spirit, and spirit body. That will be unfolded in future epochs. So he says it's therefore harder to understand the connection to them. But the peacemakers have to do then with the activation of the spirit self, which is the part of the psyche that is the first truly and purely spiritual aspect of the psyche. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And this has to do with the life spirit. And then finally, the spirit body. Blessed are you when men revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. The followers of the future, I suppose, will be reviled and persecuted on his account. What it has to do with the spirit body, I don't know. The upper three are a bit, don't quite fit, and one gets the sense here that maybe it's Steiner's architectonic, that he's got all these 9 subtle bodies, and they must conform. Since 6 of them conform, then the upper 3 must also conform, whether they do or not. Steiner's not always successful at doing this, but okay, so that's his analysis of the Beatitudes, the 9 Beatitudes of the Sermon on the Mount.